Welcome to the Dance Centre podcast. I am your host, Claire French, and I'm joining you from the traditional unceded territories of the Musqueam, Squamish and Tsleil-Waututh peoples, also known as Vancouver, Canada. I'll be talking to dancers, choreographers and other members of the dance world here on the West Coast to find out more about their creative work and practices and to discuss what it means to us to be dance professionals today. Thanks for joining us. Lee Su-Feh is a performance maker, educator and writer who has spent the last 40 years exploring the human body as a site of intersecting habits and histories. Born and raised in Malaysia, she was indelibly marked by teachers who strove to find a contemporary Asian expression out of the remnants of colonialism and dislocated traditions. She left Malaysia in 1985 for Paris, France, and later Canada, where she co-founded Battery Opera with David McIntosh. She has pursued a lifelong study and practice of Chinese martial arts, Qigong, and Taoism. Since 2010, she has been a student and practitioner of Fitzmaurice voicework and is currently a certified lead trainer of this work. So I think, I'd love to just kind of preface this as we start with just around that idea of the ongoingness and the evolution of your practice over the decades. And I think what's lovely about that at this point in the podcast series is that we are talking to people who are at very different stages of their careers. And so we have people who are just starting out, just up and coming. We also have people who are right in the thick of change, like those kinds of things. And I think this is another example of revealing what artists go through in committing to a life as an artist, or just finding oneself in a life with art, with art making. Yeah. So I'd love for you to just maybe, if you're interested, to just use that as an opening, as you have said. If you have any reflections at this point or any insight you'd like to share on that idea, maybe of ongoingness and evolution of your career or of your practice, actually.
I guess as I was listening to you, what came up for me is the realization that your body is this ongoing project that continually changes and shifts. Aging, getting older, growing up, and then growing old. So it's constantly changing. And to be a dancer, to have said at some point that, you are dedicating yourself to this practice of dancing is to basically dedicate yourself to this constant asking yourself what's going on with this body. Dancing itself is a constant shifting action, right? You're shifting your weight from one to another. The moves move from one to another. So nothing is rigid and fixed. So you extrapolate that, and as you learn new things about yourself, other things are unveiled and other questions come up. So I guess that's kind of how I see it, nothing is fixed, and dance is kind of like the quintessential, it's the form where you actually have to confront that nothing is fixed.
I like the word quintessential. It was also making me think of all of the kind of cliches around dance and around what it is to be a dancer that I would like us to, talk about. Maybe we'll get to later, or maybe we'll just leave that in the, hanging out in the air. But I want to say that dancing is a verb. It's not to be a dancer is not to be like a table or a chair or the bar that's in the room, or even the studio, or even somebody who goes to a studio. It's what somebody does in the studio. It's how somebody is with their body.
Mm-hmm.
And then there's the whole range of things within that. But I think it's a reminder. It's a definite reminder that to dance as you age, to dance at any age, you choose in some ways how to dance, or there is a layer at which you can choose how you dance, or you can choose your relationship with dance. And I think it's sometimes very hard for dancers to remember that, that you can choose that. I think that's one thing. Again, we might get to that in terms of your mentoring and your role in the BC dance community, which is major. So already I'm trying to put 40 years of Su-Feh's influence into 1 minute. So I will, I'll calm down on that front a little bit.
But as you speak, I think, sorry, we can try and cram 40 years in this kind of refracted
Yeah.
way in this. But as you were talking, yeah, what comes to mind is the realization or the discovery of all the different ways we dance. And I'm remembering as a young person what I discovered dance while I was I guess 16 or 17, and I was part of a sort of children's theater experiment
Oh.
by a woman named Janet Pillay, who's now she's sort of known now in the region in Southeast Asia for her work in cultural mapping. But in the 80s, the beginning of an experiment of that led her into cultural mapping was working with young people about making theater together. And she was part of a group of artists who became my mentors and teachers, who were, asking like what it means to make theater or make performance in this post-colonial Malaysia.
Mm-hmm.
Anyway, so as a young person, I was part of this children's theater experiment, and my encounter with dance was watching my first dance teacher choreograph a scene with, this legendary bird, Jentayu. And I remember with another performer, with another member of the group. And I think, I was like, I want to do that. I want to be able to move my body through space, and I want to learn how to do that. And so there's that call of dancing, of just that kinesthetic, shimmering that another body calls you into. And I think like that's certainly a desire in dancing, some kind of beacon into learning or experiencing more of my body, or a sense of, there's a way of being in the world that is not just, in the idea of something, but it's just a reminder of that we are in our bodies, to be embodied, so to speak.
Yeah.
And then I think as you follow that desire, what I experienced was feeling the joy of dancing with another body, when you learn a sequence in class and you're going across the floor together, and then you learn that pleasure of, wow, like that joy of being with another. And that's also, and some people encounter dancing that way, like from dancing with another, and that's the invitation into the joy. So, and I guess that's like being in your body with another body, like how we bodies together.
Yeah. And I think there's something about with the joy in the learning of that, or in the being together with somebody so intimately, in a way, because dance is a very intimate form, our whole body is involved. The joy might not always be there. Sometimes there is that kind of like, sometimes the tension is there, or the anxiety to dance with another in a certain way is in the way of the joy, or the joy is deeper, or it's fleeting. And there's something about that, I think, that is also very much present in your belief system and your philosophies and values, that it's holistic, and that this sense of joy is something we find, and is also a kind of transient, maybe, but our quest for it is enough for
Yeah,
us to
yeah, yeah.
continue. Yeah.
Yeah, it's not automatic joy.
No, absolutely. I think that's really important, because I think there is
Yeah, yeah.
something. I just want to come back to when you were saying it's not an idea necessarily; it's actually an experiential thing. But I also feel like there's a lot of imagination involved in that, and I think that's maybe where you activate a sense of joy, or you choose to follow that line to find
Mm-hmm.
it, and there's an imagination involved. And it seems like from your
Yeah.
experience in the children's theatre that they came together, because you were watching this bird. You wanted to be the bird. You didn't want to be the person moving the bird in place. It was
Yes,
almost,
yes.
there's something lovely about that, I think,
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
that keeps that sense of body, beyond the human form.
Yeah. Well, we are. I mean, our bodies are designed, I've become like
Yeah.
really interested in neuroscience lately, and of course our imaginations are a vital part of what it is to be human and to experience life. As a human being, we process our sensations with and through ideas, and in the process, I think sometimes we get like caught up in our ideas of ourselves, and we forget, especially in the world we live in,
Mm-hmm.
and the culture that for the most part we live in, and our devices also push us into that direction, that we increasingly live in our ideas and less in our bodies. And so, often people say, oh, I just want to get out of my head and into my body. But as my voice teacher, Catherine Fitzmaurice, says, it's not really about getting out of your head, but can you bring your body to your head?
Mm-hmm.
Your head is part of your body.
Yeah, beautiful.
Mhm.
Maybe we should just stay with the Fitzmaurice work for a second around that, because voice and the use of voice in expression, but also in as an embodied practice, I think is something you can speak about as an kind of specialist expert and, practitioner. You have so much insight, having come from a dance background, performing background, into voice work, which I think is a really interesting journey. And I find with your work that your storytelling is very much, I think, from an embodied place, which means that the storytelling is not necessarily telling fictions or kind of narratives per se, but there is a sense of locating and situating the body inside a story. And even as a listener and as a viewer of your work, I felt that quite strongly. Has the Fitzmaurice voice work helped that? Would you say you found storytelling through the Fitzmaurice voice work, or?
I I have a sense that storytelling, for some weird reason, has always been something that I do, even before I discovered Fitzmaurice voice work. And I think I was always working with my voice even before I studied Fitzmaurice voice work.
Mm-hmm.
And it has something to do with one of the things I always say is, oh, I'm now a voice teacher, and I'm a voice teacher because I actually hated my voice for like most of my life.
Right.
And of course, I don't think that's a very uncommon feeling. Like
No.
as a voice teacher, I encounter loads of people who, when they are asked to, I'll say, tell me the story of your voice, and there's almost always a moment where someone says, oh, I felt my voice was judged, and so there's always like tension around my voice. So yeah, again, I'm gonna do lots of Catherine Fitzmaurice quotes here, but one of the things she says is your voice is where the material and the immaterial intersect. And by that, I don't know what she meant by that, but what I read from that is, on the one hand, it is a very concrete thing, it's an action that comes out of breath and vibration in your vocal folds, and how you hold your body, how you move your body, all that affects your breath. So it's very based on the material. But because we use our voice to communicate with others and other humans, we use language to communicate with others, and we've needed language to communicate with our caregivers when we were vulnerable. It immediately brings into play our imagination, our relationship to power, to care, to love, to tenderness, to abandon, all these things. So it's kind of broad.
Absolutely.
And wonderful at the same time, right? Like, there's so much to discover.
Mm-hmm.
And so that's one thing. And in some ways, I kind of feel like maybe my journey to becoming a dancer came from this fraughtness around my voice, because I started in theater, and I remember as a young person, it was just always a mystery to me when, the few voice classes I encountered, and the great discomfort about being in my voice. And so I chose to be silent. Mark Diamond, I don't know if
I
you
remember Mark
remember.
Diamond.
Yeah, Mark Diamond, who was one of I guess he was the
He's a theatre professor,
yeah
wasn't he, at
the
SFU? Yeah.
yeah at SFU, and I think he began the theater
Hmm.
area. He said once, dancers have chosen at some point to be silent,
Mm.
but eventually your body is going to want to speak.
Yeah, I love that.
And yeah, like, yeah, your body eventually will want to do all the things it's designed to do. And speaking, making sound is one of them, moving is one of them.
And so as I age too and have reached 50 this year, I'm thinking about my musical theatre training and how I kind of left that, but how I always thought about dance as a kind of singing for
Mm,
myself, because it was always somewhat connected to this kind of silent voice in me that came from the musical theatre side. And now I'm discovering rhythm again in tap and all sorts of different dance styles, which is leading me back to the voice. And I mean, I talk a lot all the time. So, so there's even I think when I dance, I'm always kind of somewhat talking, even if the voice in my head is getting louder. So I really feel that. I really feel what you're talking about. And I think there's something really empowering, or potentially empowering, in dancers thinking about they've chosen to be silent for a while. I just think that's a really healthy space to think about, because it allows, I think, to one of the first words you said in this podcast, which was, as I'm listening to you. And I think, okay, so then dancers we have the ability to listen to our bodies. And if we can find that space, I think there's something really beautiful in that. So there's a reason for the silence, which is a very positive relationship to oneself. So I just wanted to mention that, because I think we can forget sometimes that level of embodiment is a kind of embodiment. There are so many degrees of embodiment, that there is something our bodies can tell us in that space if we're open to listening to it. So
yeah, and I think that what you say, that's a very beautiful retelling of the story of the silence of dancers, because that it's a choice, and sometimes we need to be, yeah, sometimes we just need to make a space so that you can listen better.
yeah,
Having said that, and I think listening, as you say, is the key word here. Like in Taoism, you can't move without stillness, and you can't be still without movement. One leads to the other. And I think similarly you need to listen in order to speak. And in order to speak, you also need to listen, and that essentially is what communication, what I teach as a voice teacher. How do you listen to yourself, but you're also listening to the other? And then so as we talk to each other, we're co-listening, like co-talking.
mm-hmm.
And that
Yeah,
happens in dancing, you're
yeah,
listening with your whole body.
mm-hmm.
But I think it also is true that if we don't listen deeply enough to all that our bodies want and need, it is easy to be silenced by what we perceive, the rooms that dance happens in, the tradition of how dance is transmitted. I think sometimes, I mean, that's where the oppression happens, like certain bodies are silenced. So these kind of like systemic silencings, or things that we don't really spend too much, yeah, like our habits that are in our
Yes,
bodies.
yes.
And I think to be in the question of, oh, where does this habit come from?
Mm-hmm. Learned, inherited,
Mm-hmm.
or even just developed,
Yeah.
negatively developed over time, right?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
I mean, that's one of the things I'm so, I guess is part of my grappling, is for me, I exist in this very acute awareness. I come from Malaysia, which used to be a British colony, and of course, all of Southeast Asia
Mm,
has been so vital to the European colonial project.
yeah.
Spices and everything, and the shipping routes that went through Southeast Asia.
Yeah.
So I'm acutely aware that I work from a colonized body. That, I for most of my life, I grew up thinking and believing that to be a better person, I had to be white, I had to speak English in a certain way, and English was the proper language to speak. European languages were better than, these were, ideas sitting around in my body.
Yeah.
And everything I do is trying to disentangle habits from like what actually is me and what is learned, what is useful, it's this constant spring cleaning of one's body.
Yeah, absolutely. And so can we talk a little bit about your experience of going to France then and then to Canada? Because that must have been, in terms of like speaking about cultural references or in listening to cultures or feeling like you are either silenced or able to express yourself. What was the draw to France particularly? And then, yeah, just in some ways tracing aspects of that journey, however you feel in this conversation you'd like to share that.
So I think when I graduated from high school in Malaysia, I had already been doing children's theater and taking dance lessons. And the dance lessons I took from Marion de Cruz were traditional Malay folk and classical dance, court dance,
Wonderful.
as well as Graham technique. So
right.
she was already working with, she had just recently come back from, New York. But before that, she had studied Malay dance, and she had done her master's on the Malay dance from the East Coast, a tradition called Timang Burong, Joget Gamelan, yeah.
Gamelan.
And so she was already in this question of what's contemporary Asian expression, and what is the relationship to the global contemporary. These are my words, not Marion's.
Yeah.
So when I graduated high school, my option at that time that I was sort of like, which one, was either to go to Indonesia, to the institute there to study Indonesian dance, and to basically pursue a sort of Asian expression of dancing, or to go to Germany. And I had been studying German for about 3 years, throughout high school, because to go to Germany to study theater in a university. Germany, because, education was free in Germany, and I thought, I'll just have to go there and it's free. I just have to learn German. And the idea of learning German came also from my mother, who had, studied in Germany. And so she speaks German.
Oh, wow. Excellent. Wunderbar.
So Germany or Indonesia, that was like, what I was balancing with. And then I saw this person, Larry Leong, perform. And Larry Leong was a Malaysian of Chinese descent like me, who had been living in Paris for the last 15 years. And he came back 1 year to perform. And when I saw him perform, he brought a group of dancers with him. I had never seen anyone dance like that, His body was just so fluid, and it was grounded, but it was also watery. It was also airy. It just moved through. It was so elemental. And also, it's hard for me to talk about this without having to also to talk about the socio-political environment that was in, ethnically Chinese, growing up in Malaysia. Like, one of the things I felt was a lot of shame about being Chinese. And I thought of being Chinese as a very uncultured thing. Anyway, long story short, very complex ideas about race and identity.
Yeah.
Just part of the legacy of being in Malaysia. And seeing Larry dance, and I got this hint of, that there's a possibility, because he also, I somehow understood that I felt like he did martial arts of some kind, and suddenly this avenue of, that there's a way for me to dance without having to negate a part of me. Anyway, I'm 18. I go up to Larry after a show or at a party, and I said, I'm going to come to Paris and study with you.
Amazing.
And he says, well, sure, call me when you get there. And so I did. I basically dropped my plans to go to Germany or to Indonesia, and I went to Paris, and I spent 2 years basically taking dance classes with Larry and with other people.
Wow. Already ready to move though. You were already you were
Yeah.
prepared to leave, go somewhere else.
Yes.
To go, and so that was absolute, you were looking for the opening or the invitation. Well, you
Yeah.
made the invitation, but you created it. But at the same time, that was exactly what you were going to do. Go somewhere else.
Go somewhere
In that
else. Yeah.
moment. Yeah.
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 And going somewhere else, I have to say, is also a part of the legacy of being an ethnic minority in Malaysia, because you start to feel like that there's not a lot of options for you or future. So in some ways, you're primed in all the different ways to go somewhere else.
Mm-hmm.
Maybe eventually to come home, but definitely. Yeah. So I'm not alone there, is what I'm saying.
Yes, yes. Well, I felt the same thing. I felt like I couldn't really explore all I wanted to explore by staying in England.
Mm-hmm.
Or even staying in Europe. I mean, yeah, granted, I only made it to North America, but there were logistics and conveniences in that my age but there was still, and I still imagine that there will be other places I will go and experience and live, and travel is a huge thing for me and always has been, in the world. So I think there is a draw for that, for other experiences.
Yeah, and maybe that's the thing. As I listen to you talk about it, it's like what parts are unknown for you, so that you can feel your body into those unknown parts. And I'm just going to drop another quote here, which comes from Zab Mabungu. She once said, I once heard her say, Zab Mabungu is based in Montreal, and she's, part Congolese, part French. She teaches African dance. And I heard her say once that dance is to be with what you don't know about yourself and what you don't know about the other. And I love this definition of dance, that dance is a way of being with what you don't know. It leads you into the unknown.
I love that too. I took a workshop with her. It was all on Zoom though, but still, I feel there is a sense. I felt like I was in a space of don't know slightly, in that there was an element, coming back to what I was saying before about finding joy as a choice.
Anyway, yeah, so I found myself in France.
Yeah, I was also thinking of the material and immaterial in that way as well. Like it's already in how you described watching, do you say Larry Leong? Is that the person's name?
Yeah.
And describing that, how you saw that performance. There's definitely a kind of, in the words you used, I felt that same kind of relationship there. And so then France and then Canada. So
yes, because so then I went to France, and I think that was, I imagined a future where I was going to be in France, more or less.
Yeah.
But then I had to come back to Malaysia very soon after I went to France, because I lost my passport. So I came back to Malaysia to get a new passport. And while I was waiting for my new passport, I met David McIntosh, who who I still work with to run Battery Opera, and we fell in love. Eventually, he became the father of my son. We're not together anymore, but we're friends. We run a company together.
Yeah.
And that's how I ended up in Canada.
Oh.
Somewhere in that shift, I met David, and then, I continued to stay in France to study dance, but we were in different countries. And then that connection brought me eventually to Canada.
I think David once told me how you actually met in Malaysia. I think I seem to remember at one point him telling me, but maybe I'll just save that one as a mystery for people out there. We can check in on that later. But I seem to remember it being a very quite a wonderful story. Something about somebody rescuing somebody or saving somebody.
Oh yeah, that was a car accident.
It's a car accident.
I mean, I met him after he had been run over by a car, so he was, and was in like a.
That's right. I wasn't making it up then. I wasn't making that up. That was true. Okay, excellent. Okay, yeah, brilliant. You see, theatrical.
That's right. Drama.
It was meant to be. Battery opera was meant to be. Yeah. And so, with the company, which we won't spend much time on the company here because that's a whole other, kind of podcast moment for another time. But, this whole thing about the interdisciplinariness, the collaborative, the co-directing, the working with dancers and actors, creating both dance performances that could also be seen as theater pieces. There's always been this element of crossover, I think, and experiment of form that breaks conventions. And back then, in the days of Spectator and those kinds of things, I wouldn't have necessarily talked about it from this kind of post-colonial perspective. I don't think any of us were, or not all of us were in dialogue about those things. It just wasn't, so much of a thing 20 years ago, and it should have been. But at the same time, all of those things that they were all in the works and have continued to be in the works ever since. I feel like there's something about you taking that, and both of you have done this, with the battery opera work, but your individual practitioner perspectives have launched careers from the battery opera work that have gone in quite different directions, but you still sometimes work with the same people. And so you did build an ensemble almost in the training or in the way in which you went about the work. And I think that's one of the things when we say how much of a trailblazer you are and how significant your impact has been on BC dance world, I think that's because of these opportunities you gave people to be involved in these projects. And then they've related to those projects for their own work so much that they've continued to be able to do that themselves. I'd love to hear more about your individual practitioner perspective coming out of battery opera to where you are now. And I feel like the way in which you mentor people is interesting. And maybe there's a bit of room here to talk about that, because I think you've really found that in Canada because of the way that battery opera was opened up the world for dancers or physical theatre performers and all of these people to work together, but outside of the conventions of all of those forms. So does that give you something to go on and talk about? Or?
I think all the years of working with David, and still, we still sort of work together. But in some ways, it's like what Zab says, like it's a way of being with what you don't know about yourself and with the other. And in some ways, one of the thing with it seemed with battery opera was we were very different people. We still are very different people with different aesthetics almost, and somehow we fell in love, and somehow we decided to work together. And I can't say it was ever a comfortable place, working together. And working together is never comfortable anyway. Just like living together isn't comfortable. Like being with another human being, as we talked about earlier, there's joy, but it's not automatic joy. There's a lot of discomfort to grapple for the joy, to negotiate for the joy. So, and I think all those things are things that I know, like having been born and raised in a very multicultural country, a very culturally diverse country like Malaysia. So many languages, to grow up with many languages. So you're already in that body of constant negotiating. But I think to do that through a company, you become very conscious about it because you have to write your mandate, you have to write your artistic statement. So you're already looking at what's happening, and then you have to form it into your artistic mandate. So all to say, I think battery opera kind of, and I guess also because both David and I didn't grow up in institutions, so we didn't necessarily inherit automatic ways of being an institution, and we had to figure out what it was to be a company,
which helped many other people, I think, realize that being a company didn't mean one thing necessarily. Didn't mean
right. And that makes me happy to hear you say that it helped other people. And every time you say that, I feel a little shy, like really, really.
I'm sure, but at the same time, there is an element of, for us, particularly, Restless Productions, you were on our board when we first started. And I remember you saying, like, your mandate and your mission statement, like, we would sometimes get them muddled. Like we would sometimes, and they're still muddled for me, being a very institutional kid, scheduled to the hilt my entire life. There was something about, for me, that was a really hard thing. And we've since shifted with age and with experience and with COVID and all of those things. We've really shifted into a place that we feel is much more authentic for us. But it also means that we're giving it time. And it feels really, really healthy to be doing that right now. Really healthy to just give it time. And I think that's the one thing, 20 years ago, I didn't quite understand time in the same way. So.
Yeah, absolutely. And I'm with you. I feel like COVID has taught us all, like collectively, to think about time differently, space differently, and our bodies differently. And there's a lot of opportunity right now to really learn how to move differently in the world.
So I keep thinking with my research that, all the just in terms of language, to take the time to do something, taking time is the wrong expression. Taking time to do something means, I feel there's a sense of ownership of that time, which is like taking it for that experience. But being with time or having something unfold in time, those kinds of subtle shifts of language become completely unsubtle. Like the moment you make the shift in language, the moment you realize that it's an entirely different experience you are talking about. And so I've just been going through that as well with my whole, that is changing how I practice, because
absolutely,
back round to what we said before, like you arrive with certain preconceptions and learned notions and learned things, and it's in the language you speak.
It's like how we talked about the difference between like embodiment and idea also. Like to take time is, as you say, you there's a distance between you and time. It's like you can take it. But to be in time is, your body is in time already, and then it calls upon you to experience time differently. And it's something like, I give an exercise. Yeah, you feel your breath. You feel the breath come into your ribs, and lungs, and expand your rib cage, say, and then you exhale and you feel your rib cage descend. And if you're like me, when I do that, I'm seeing my rib cage expand, and I feel it in some way, but I'm mostly seeing my rib cage. But what if I brought my so-called intelligence into my rib cage, and then I experience the breath coming in from there? It's that little shift in where you place your awareness, rather than seeing your body as a part. Feeling your body as something that you're in is a very different thing. And I guess that's the space that dance or performance, time-based things invite you into.
Yeah, I'm thinking, it's kind of conceptual metaphor language in my research, like Lakoff and Johnson talk a lot about conceptual metaphor, and they've been very useful for me to just think about how just shifting that language, and even walking into a space and walking into a social situation, because I'm also interested in kind of social cognition and those kinds of areas, and how you enter and what you tell yourself in the moment that you enter the space, as if that space belongs to others, that you are walking into the space of others, or you are, those kinds of things I think are just really much more in my awareness and cognition now than and then before, which is is inviting, but it's also forcing and imposing a change. It's doing both. It is, there is a force still there. So that's exciting.
Yeah, the stories of our experience sometimes take precedence over the actual experience.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah. Absolutely.
Yeah.
Absolutely.
And as I get older, I think that's the one thing I'm learning. It's like, that's an old story, and I'm in a different experience now.
Yeah.
I want to just because this is making me think about this theater and dance thing. And earlier you had mentioned rhythm. I too have become quite obsessed with rhythm. And I would say maybe when I was yeah, this question of, oh, what's theater, what's dance? It's all the same thing. I think what dance invites us into, in a, not that it doesn't happen in other forms, but dance is in some way makes us confront it, is rhythm.
Yes.
How we work with it, what's the function of rhythm, and and for me, rhythm is the thing that disrupts or enlivens an idea that could be rigid.
Mm.
An idea is a container, and then when there's rhythm underneath it, then that container can start to vibrate. And then when we're in, this vibrating thing, then it's a lot more alive than just a container.
Mm-hmm. And it breathes.
Yeah, and I think that's, for example, the power of, like, good storytelling inevitably works with rhythm and phrasing, and poetry, works with rhythm
Mm.
and phrasing, and I think that, like, great theater, great playwriting always grapples with rhythm. So I think it's not just, dance does that. Dance brings your bones and your body into this play with rhythm, but certainly rhythm exists when we use our voices, because breathing is a rhythmic thing, and
Yeah.
I'm just riffing. I'm just nerding on this kind of. I'm trying
Yeah.
to answer this question of, different disciplines and how they intersect. And
So my interest is in rhythm, the external rhythms that we might, like you say, set or like nail, that we have to
Mhm,
nail it so that, we're on rhythm all the time.
mhm.
But also the process of getting to that is really about being honest with yourself as well. So
Yes.
one of my tap teachers says tap keeps you honest, because the accents in tap dancing means that everybody hears the accent that you have just made, which may not be the
Mhm.
one that you intended. And so it's the same with the voice. I mean, it is the same with dance, but sometimes not everybody feels like they understand dance. And so they don't necessarily notice it that in the same way, like if you're not making sounds with your dance. But I would say it's the same. It is the
Yeah.
same in dance. Like if you are interested in honesty, if you're interested in that, and you don't have to dance for that reason and from that place.
Mhm.
But because I like that right now, that feels really good. It keeps me honest, and I feel that's quite lovely.
Yeah, I was in a couple of weeks ago. I was in a workshop with Seku. It was a house dance workshop.
Oh yeah, great.
Sekuheru. Anyway, I've never really done house dance, so it was
Mm,
all new to me.
mm,
But and he teaches almost completely with no words. Like, he just does something, and you follow, and of course the rhythms get more complex, and you build it, and I remember the second day just feeling like I had a lot of frustration, because it felt like, oh, you're developing the rhythm, a little faster than I can manage, and so I felt the frustration, and then you feel the demons come up, when you feel frustrated. It's like, oh, I'm not worthy. I suck, all those things. But then miraculously, sometimes, you find it. And
mm,
what you find is really not that you look exactly like the awesome dancer next to you or the teacher, but you find the alignment in yourself,
mm,
and you find the ease. And that moment feels like, as much as, you grapple with the demons thinking you suck, but when you find that those little spaces, it feels like you found God, like, in your
mm.
body. And so, in this, like, struggle, you encounter, like, this range of your devils, but also the divine in
Mm,
yourself.
the sublime.
It's,
Mm.
yeah, it's like, the whole experience.
Yeah, 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 that's amazing. Yeah, and I feel like it is kind of almost like giving yourself permission to be in these spaces, right? Just like you say, the don't know,
Hmm.
and the seeking out experiences that put you in that place of
Yeah.
not knowing. So just we'll briefly talk about some of your works that I think have come out of your individual practice, but are still obviously collaborative. Dance Machine and Spiraling by the Sea, The Territory Between Us. And people can look up these works on your website at leesufeh.com. And find out more about them. There's lots of really interesting stuff on your website about these. And the Dance Center has lots of information on these pieces over the years. And so I do encourage people to look at those. But I just wanted to mention the fact that there is what you're talking about, the working with the collaborative element, not just with people, but also with landscape or territory or mask or bamboo sticks or something. Like there is something like very materially interdisciplinary about the work. And I wondered if you would like to talk about that, because I feel like that's also what the collaboration is, with the landscape, with an object, with material. Would you like to say anything about that, and maybe lead into your residency project at the Dance Center as well around that?
Well, first of all, as a martial artist, I've always worked with things, with a spear, with a sword, and the way you're trained as a martial artist is always to relate to space, that you're activating space, that the things that your body does is really just to activate the space around you, to be in partnership with the body around you or that you're with. And so then a weapon is just a way of reaching into that space. And so, practicing with a sword means I have to be aware of what my body is doing, but how the energy from my body, reaches into the tassel of the sword or into the point of the sword and beyond. So, these become extensions of you. But I think around 2008, I maybe more intentionally started to explore, and I would say I didn't have this word then, but the kind of like an exploration of animism. Huh. I was interested in this question of, because I'd been studying martial arts and doing a lot of qigong, this idea, moving energy around me, and sometimes in Taoism one talks about the alchemy that happens when you work with energy. And so I became interested in, I wonder if I shared this work with artists who didn't work with their bodies, like would that be some kind of alchemy where, I'm turning energy into matter and object somehow. Anyway, so that led to, there was a few years where I was working with setting up processes where I could be in this question of how do I turn energy into matter? So, for example, I worked with this French costume designer, Alexandra Berthaud, who had worked with me and Benoit Lachambre, when we collaborated on Body Scan.
Yes.
And Alexandra, works, she's a costume designer, but I invited her to basically do my practice with me, say for a week or 2 weeks. And then she would respond by, making objects. And then the process was I lived with those objects for a year to see what came up. What was my response to that? And my response to the objects was then to go into the studio and, they were like knitted fabric things with things that belonged to me, kind of like interwoven. And I went into the studio with them and with Justine Chambers as an assistant and kind of a collaborator in some way, someone to be in conversation with. Yeah. And that was kind of how the concept of Dance Machine came up. I think in that moment, I went, I'd like to create an environment where my body is connected to space through my costume. And that if I move, then the costume will move, the space will move. And then if the space moves, then the audience will move. And all I have to do is respond to the audience. I don't have to make a dance, I'm already in the... I talk about this as the the simplest dance. And the simplest dance being a dance that just comes out of responding to the world around me, where I don't have to make something up.
Yeah.
And I think I'm still always in that quest. How do I create an environment so that I'm just responding to the world around me? I can be present in the world, and I can be present with myself and all the things I've learned and my questions, and the simplest dance is just me in partnership with the world. And so the dance machine was a kind of environment that emerged and got built, where I felt this, how am I in response with the world, could happen at many stages, from the setting up of the installation in whatever space it was, to the meeting of the human bodies, between artists in that environment, and then the audience coming into that environment.
Mm-hmm.
Fast forward to now, Touch Me, Hold Me, Let Me Go came up, is part of what I call a long, slow dance that began with me, a very similar energy object kind of thing, where I approached Bracken Hanus Corlett. He's an artist from the Wikinuke and Kahus nations here on the West Coast. And I asked him if he would be interested in carving a mask for me after we had been in conversation together for some time. So we spent a year talking to one another, just talking as two artists, getting to know one another, sharing our, stories of our relationship to our family history, but also our relationship to the land here, to belonging, to our practices. And then at the end of this year, he carved this mask. So, and then my task on receiving this mask was just to submit to it. Just, okay, this is the mask, and I'll just do whatever the mask tells me to do. Although, when I did that, I thought I would just put on the mask and a mask dance, I would make a mask dance. But so he made me the mask, and it started this process where I put on the mask, and I brought it into another process that I was in at Dance Makers, where I was artist in residence. And I thought we would collectively make this, this mask piece. But then the mask said no.
Said no. I love this. I love this. Yeah, I love this.
Right. Like, you listen to the mask, and the mask is like saying no. And I talk about this, in this performance that I'm making, or that's emerging. Great. The mask said no. Like, how do you hear the no? The no comes up in the body, and this attunement to the no in one's body is important to me. Like how we listen to the no's, because how you listen deeply to the no, how you express the no, what is your next action when you say no, I think is as important, if not more important, than how you say yes to something. Anyway, this relationship with the mask for me is a bit like me asking Bracken the carver to choreograph me. And something Bracken said was really beautiful was he felt like carving this mask from, a piece of red cedar. And he knows, that this cedar came from a certain tree that fell in the 1800s. So, that there's already a history of this piece of wood that is known. He talked about the responsibility he felt in carving into this piece of block of cedar, and how that was sometimes overwhelming to him, or he felt greatly this sense of responsibility for this life force that was in this piece of wood, that was part of a fallen tree in the forest. And when he gave me the mask, he was handing me the same responsibility.
Yes, absolutely. So then suddenly responding to something, a responsibility, the two things together become a little more related, right?
Exactly. Yes. So responding, responsibility, and dance, in fact, as a responsibility that we have, also our voices as a responsibility we have to ourselves and to ourselves in the world, I think is what I care about.
Yeah, and I think, as we bring this conversation to a close, unfortunately, I think there's also this element of coming back to what the ongoingness and evolution of a practice is. I mean, it's a perfect way of, I think, like helping maybe explain a little bit about how choosing to be an artist in life or choosing to have a creative life is also choosing to respond to and to have a responsibility for this recognizing life force, as you said. Like there is an element of all of those things together. So that comes with the legacy of that life force, the enlivening, as you've mentioned, all of these things, the activating of it.
And we certainly don't have to be so-called professional artists to take on that responsibility. This notion also of being an artist is also a very culturally specific thing. Like in many cultures, the artist is the farmer, is the mayor, is the we're all like embracing, or there's always the invitation to embrace that responding to and responsibility.
Yes, and one of the things that Heather Bray, was like pulling materials for us to talk about for the dance center, and one of the things is Su-Feh is so much more than a choreographer, and there's and like you say, like an artist is, we don't own these terms, coming back to this dance as a verb and all of these things we talked about in the beginning. All of these things are things we are doing. They're the ways we are responding and the ways we're choosing to be in the world with others, as you said in the beginning. But there's also, I just want to mention that there is a craft involved. There is a commitment to a practice through all of this. And with the collaborators you work with and everybody, there is a commitment to not just being creative and responding, but also that responsibility is taken very seriously in the preparation for then being with other people in the world in terms of art making, which starts very early. The art making, like you say, is not necessarily now we're going to make a piece of art that an audience will watch or that we can rehearse. It's the way in which you approach something, the way in which you converse with people during a process. And I think that's one difference for me, is that making a distinction about that as an artist's life is like the things you choose to respond to, and the crafting is already in your response. It's almost like it's not a later stage, it's already, it's something that comes with paying attention to how you pay attention. Perhaps I think there is that, and how you converse and how you do those things. So I love this idea that we are going to experience in June a part of your long slow dance, that we get to be with you in that journey. Thank you so much for talking with me at this point.
Thank you. That's been delightful, Claire. I haven't talked to you for a long time, so
it's been so long. It's been so long.
Huge pleasure.
Yeah, it's been. Thank you so much for your time.
Oh, thank you.
See you in the flesh soon, I hope.
Yes, soon.
Yes, excellent. See you then.
Okay.
Bye. Thank you so much for listening. We would love for you to subscribe, rate, and review wherever you get your podcasts, as this will help other listeners find us and help us to grow our dance audience. We'll be back next month. In the meantime, you can follow us on Facebook at The Dance Center, Twitter at Dance Center, and Instagram at The Dance Center BC. And if you'd like to support our work, please consider making a donation. Just go to our website at thedancecenter.ca, where you'll find extensive information about our upcoming programs and events. The music for the Dance Center podcast was composed by James B. Maxwell. Always a pleasure to connect with you through dance. Until next time.